If you enjoyed the channel and our video content and would like to support us, you can do this in a couple of ways. You can sign up to our Patreon site, which is a monthly subscription to one of our 4 tiers, each giving you something different from early access interviews up to exclusive unseen footage. There's also the option of a one-off donation via PayPal, which allows you the option to donate an amount of your choice. Both options really help to keep this channel going and to continue putting out regular content for you good folk. So please take a look at aircrewinterview.tv/donate, and I thank you in advance. Thank you and enjoy. Brent, when did you become interested in aviation?
It really started out when I was a child. I grew up without a dad, but I had 3 uncles that were all enlisted in the Air Force. One was an avionics technician, another one was a security policeman, and then the third one, which I didn't get to spend much time with, he was assigned to tankers. But in the summertime, I would go visit, especially the avionics technician, the security policeman, and it was always a big deal for me as a young child to get to go out to the base and see airplanes taking off and landing. And then I had a step-grandfather who worked as a machinist at McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, where I grew up. And after he retired when I was a young boy, occasionally he would take me up to Lambert Airport there in St. Louis. There was a parking lot at the end of the runway, and we would just sit there, and he would quiz me on, well, what's this airplane, what's that airplane, and he taught me how to identify like civilian airliners and stuff. So just as a little kid, being around it and growing up, or maybe get to go to an air show, and always thrilling.
Absolutely. So why did you want to join the Navy, and when you joined, what aircraft did you start training on?
Well, the Navy was kind of a by default thing because of growing up around the Air Force. I thought you want to fly airplanes or want to fly fighters, you go to the Air Force. So went and visited, early on in high school with the Air Force recruiter. And I kind of learned actually later on, the primary path to fly fighters, or some kind of interesting airplane in the Air Force was to go to the Air Force Academy. And I didn't quite have the grades or, the sports and the participation and whatnot for an academy appointment. ROTC wasn't all that interesting, so I talked to the Navy, talked to the Marines, and ultimately ended up receiving a Navy ROTC scholarship. I was living in St. Louis and went to the University of Missouri-Columbia, where I originally went there on the scholarship. I later turned the scholarship down. That's a whole nother saga. And then I was commissioned in August of 1989 and went immediately to flight school after that.
Yeah, so let's talk about that. Where did you start on? What aircraft did you start on? And what aircraft did you end up on before you went to the Tomcat?
So in the Navy, you start out, everybody goes through aviation indoctrination. It looks kind of like some of the scenes from Officer and a Gentleman that some people remember, the Dilbert Dunkers and running the obstacle course and things like that. Now, we were commissioned, so we weren't living with the drill instructors, thankfully. But you still did all the same academics and the same physical fitness and whatnot. That's about 6 weeks. And then it was off to primary flight training at Whiting Field, Naval Air Station Whiting Field, northeast of Pensacola. And there I flew the T-34C, the Turbo Mentor, your first orange and white airplane, single-engine turboprop with the Pratt & Whitney PT-6A. Very forgiving airplane. After that, then once you graduate from primary flight training, you've got, I want to say, about 60, 70 hours, somewhere in there. And this is when you make your choice to what pipeline you want to go to. And what choice you receive is going based on your performance. So you put down my first choice was jets. I don't even remember what the second and third choice was. It kind of didn't matter to me. It was either jets or other. And then you showed up on a Friday afternoon, and there was a list hanging outside some door. I can't remember what it was, and I had received jets. Now, an interesting thing about the Navy is that the jet community, especially at the time, was actually the smallest community. The helicopter community in the Navy is enormous, and the fixed-wing turboprop community is also enormous. So I was selected for jets, and then from there, you get assigned. Back in the day, it was either Kingsville Naval Air Station, Beeville Naval Air Station, or Meridian, which was in Mississippi. And I had selected Mississippi and sent there. Show up to Meridian, Mississippi, and you're now into intermediate jet training. And this is back when the Navy had 2 jets that they used for training. You start out in the T-2C Buckeye, a little twin engine where the engines are actually underneath the airplane, straight wing airplane, very forgiving to fly. The Navy used it as a spin trainer for years. And that's the aircraft that that's when you do your first carrier qualification. You go to whatever the appropriate training carrier was. I was the last class that went to the USS Lexington. And then they retired it after that. It's now a museum down in Corpus Christi, which always makes me feel young. And I think just the basic there was 6 traps, or might actually only 2 touch and goes and 4 traps. It's not much. It's just, hey, you saw the aircraft carrier, you've got a baseline. And then back in the day when the Navy still had the 2 different jets, then you went to advanced jet training, still at Meridian, Mississippi. You literally just went down the hall from one end of the hangar to the other. And then you started flying the TA-4, where you got into more advanced concepts. It was kind of a quick ramp up for familiarization, instruments, and formation. But then you would actually drop practice bombs off the airplane. You would strafe, very fundamental air combat maneuvering. And then you would go do a slightly longer, but daytime only, carrier qualification. And I finished that in November of 1991.
So the big question is, what aircraft did you want to go on to, and did everyone want to go onto the same aircraft if they were going jets?
No, I think that at the time, so you make 2 selections when you graduate and get your wings, type of aircraft, and then which coast you wanted to be on. Did you want to be East Coast or West Coast? And there was really a pretty big divide, because this is the time where so 1991, there were still a handful of A7s. A7 squadrons that hadn't yet transitioned to the F-18. Now, nobody was getting orders to the A7 because the A7 guys were all rolling into the F-18. We still had A6 intruders. There were a handful of those squadrons, and nobody really knew what was going to happen to them at the time in 1991. Subsequently, they were all going to be retired. But I would say the majority, almost everybody, was split pretty much evenly down. Did you either wanted to be an FA-18 pilot or you wanted to be an F-14 pilot? And different guys had different reasons for it. Some guys, loved the romance and the performance of the F-14. Other guys liked the idea that the FA-18 was the newer aircraft, multi-mission, more of a glass cockpit. And then certain guys had, things about which coast they wanted. Maybe their wife was from a certain area or something like that. My first choice was F-14's West Coast. I actually wanted to fly the D, but officially a choice. But they said if you ever want to have an opportunity to fly the F-14D, you've got to go to the West Coast. So I just put down F-14's West Coast, and I was high enough in my class that I got my first choice of both aircraft and coast.
Was that more like the majority of the Tomcat fleet at the time?
It really wasn't. The Tomcats, it was a very weird time in the Navy. So when I originally went to flight school, graduated in '89, that was the very tail end of the Reagan administration. Now, you're into the Bush administration, President Bush. And under President Reagan, the goal was a 600-ship Navy, 15 carrier air wings. We were going to buy the F-14D. Every air wing was going to, had 2 F-14 squadrons. You had sister squadrons. So that was kind of the 88, 89 time frame. As you get into 91 and 92, now the Berlin Wall has fallen. The Soviet Union has become less of a threat. And we were having the discussions about, quote unquote, the peace dividend and what the Navy was going to look like. Well, it was not going to be 100 ships. It was not going to be 15 carrier air wings. The F-14D they were building them at the time, but the program was kind of in limbo. The aircraft that they were going to use to replace the A6 had been canceled. That was the second generation of the A-12. That had been canceled. So you had a situation where the F-14 community was beginning to downsize, where instead of having 2 squadrons, and I want to say that each squadron would have about 10 or 12 aircraft, where you had these 2 sister squadrons, they would take one of the squadrons and decommission it and roll about half of their airplanes into what we were calling super Tomcat squadrons, which would be 14 or more aircraft. And I got to see both flavors of that. So absolutely. I wouldn't say that the F-14 was the majority, but definitely the up-and-coming community, and the only community that was growing in carrier aviation at the time was the FA-18 community.
So let's get stuck into your Tomcat time. Talk us through some of the ground training and flying training, because obviously it's a massive jet, very complicated. How did you find it going through this phase?
Yeah, definitely. It was a very different mindset coming from flight school where you're learning to be an aviator, and then your aviation skills were just kind of assumed to be a given when you showed up to F-14 training. My fleet replacement squadron was Fighter Squadron 124, the gunfighters out at NAS Miramar. And the way I would try to describe it is now you're into what would be like a graduate program of flying, where it's like it's just a given that you can fly the airplane. The familiarization phase of flying the airplane was very short. Formation was a given, and it was immediately right into now you have this very large, as you noted, huge airplane. I think a lot of people would be shocked. You think fighter, you're thinking small, nimble aircraft. This thing was 64 feet long, and our max catapult weight was 6 tons. I mean, this was not what most people would consider a small, nimble aircraft. It was a big airplane, very complex airplane. If I recall right, internally 16 fuel tanks, 16 separate fuel tanks. It's a twin engine airplane. The hydraulics were an absolute nightmare. There was a bidirectional connection system for the hydraulics. Now you've got a refueling probe, the landing gear hydraulic. And then let's, just for good measure, let's throw in wings that move with all their associated flight controls, flaps, slats, or flaps, maneuvering flaps or slats, however you want to describe it, direct lift control spoilers, stabilators instead of elevators. It was a very complex aircraft. The NATOPS manual, which think of that like an owner's manual or a user's manual for the aircraft. I still have one. For whatever reason, I kept mine. Apparently, they're rather valuable now. Is enormous. I mean, this thing is huge, and that's all the unclassified systems. Then you got into the radar, which it was very old. It was definitely outdated. It was not cutting edge technology. But the power out and the processing capability, considering it was from the 1970s, was absolutely unreal. And then you had to, get accustomed to missionized cockpits and people with different roles in the airplane at the same time. So it was a long process. And because of the downsizing, I was actually delayed getting started. But then once I got started, it was about a year of training. And one thing that was interesting for my class, we were the first undergraduate class, not guys that were experienced in the airplane, that we introduced the Bombcat era. We were the first class to drop air-to-ground rockets off the airplane.
Yeah, because I think there's a bit of a misnomer there, because everyone thought the F-14 was strictly air-to-air interceptor, but apparently it was designed to actually drop bombs from its original creation.
Yeah, it was really interesting. It's kind of funny. So the airplane, as you say, was built. It came out of Bethpage, New York, with an organic, fairly simplistic air-to-ground capability, right, where the airplane had continuous CCIP, continuously computed impact point delivery, which was phenomenally accurate, which was always amazed a lot of us. Had some of the level delivery modes. So on the right side of the cockpit, if you've ever seen some old pictures of the F-14A cockpit, I mean, it's absolute, compared to what you would see of even an F-16 or an F-18 or whatever, it is absolutely dinosaur stuff. I mean, when you look at an F-14A cockpit, there was this this column of vertical buttons that you would select what mode you wanted the displays in. And there was an air to ground button there, as I recall. And the funny thing is, you go to the airplane and that button had never been used. It was like the only new looking button on this panel. The aircraft did have an inherent air to ground capability. I don't know why that was put into the airplane. To be honest, I don't think anybody does. They just did it. The aircraft was, the Fleet Maritime, interceptor, blue water, long range, shoot down the Russian bomber horde. That was its mission. So where this air-to-ground capability that was originally built into it at Bethpage, nobody really knows the genesis of it. But yeah, you're correct. It rolled out of the factory with an air-to-ground capability.
I like that. But so what was it like working with a Rio? Did you enjoy that?
I did quite a bit. That was actually one of the reasons that I selected F-14s. I love the idea of the team concept. I grew up as an only child. I didn't have brothers or anything like that. And, seeing the movie Top Gun and everything, I'm like, and there's kind of that, obviously it's a very theatrical relationship between Maverick and Goose and everything. But I like that. I remember seeing that. I go, it would be great to go do this mission, with a teammate, and to have somebody be kind of that close to. So I like the concept of the two-seat cockpit of the two-seat fighter. It did factor into my choice. Now, the evolution of technology, with which, followed on and after my time in the F-16, I think it would have been challenging to go back to flying a two-seat airplane after having been an instructor pilot in a single-seat airplane. That getting back to the crew coordination would have been a little challenging. But loved and still have great relationships. In fact, one of my Rios that I flew 20 combat missions will be Dallas in 2 weeks, so we'll get caught up and have dinner.
Oh, that's awesome. That's brilliant. But in your opinion, what were the strengths and weaknesses of the F-14?
Well, the strengths were the range. The aircraft carried 16,000 pounds of fuel internally, and then we had two 2,000-pound drop tanks, which once you go to the fleet, you never go in without the drop tanks. It just, because we were on and off the ship so much, taking the tanks on and off the airplane just became a hassle. So we just left them on all the time. So you've got 20,000 pounds of fuel, which when you do the math equates to, give or take just a hair under 3,000 gallons of jet fuel. So, you've got an airplane that could stay airborne a long time. It could go a long range, carried a good sized payload. You see the glamour shots of the aircraft carrying 6 Phoenix missiles, going vertical, the B and the Ds and things like that. But even in our air-to-ground configuration, we had a waiver during my time where we could launch the aircraft up to 74,000 pounds, 27 tons, and that would roughly equate to 4 Mark 84s, which are 2,000-pound bombs hanging on the fuselage, and then you would have a Phoenix, a Sparrow, and 2 Sidewinders out on the shoulder stations. I mean, that is just an insane loadout for a tactical aircraft to be flying off of an aircraft carrier. So the size and the range, the range detection, the detection range of the radar was ridiculous. I can honestly say, and I'm okay to talk about this now because the crash service and the Iranians are all blown up. It was not uncommon, particularly over water, to get radar locks on fighter-sized targets, around 100 miles, which was just unreal. There's nothing in the world at the time that had that kind of power out. Now, the radar had a ton of other limitations. It was a high PRF radar that was designed to detect big targets at long ranges with closure, primarily over water, worked well over land, but it was not optimized for that. So the radar was simultaneously a blessing and a curse. Loved having the Phoenix system, just an incredible weapon. We still don't talk much about that today because a lot of that technology is, more compact in the AIM 120. So, I mean, it was, when it rolled out of Bethpage in the early 70s, I mean, that was like Star Wars for the technology. It was just a shame that the Navy didn't keep up and upgrade the avionics, later generation radars, radar detection gear. We did upgrade from the A model to the C model Phoenix. We were never going to get the AMRAAM or the later versions of Sparrow. But yeah, I mean, so the strengths, obviously, the range and the range, the downsides, how complex the aircraft was made it very maintenance intensive. It took literally, you've never seen such hardworking professionals in your life as you have ever seen of an F-14 maintenance division and keeping that aircraft mission capable.
Yeah, so what was it like going to your first frontline squadron, and did you feel ready for this?
Yeah, absolutely. VF-124 did a great job making you a very competent wingman. And it was kind of interesting. There were several hangars at Miramar, and I went to Fighter Squadron 111, which was assigned to this was the last of the West Coast Fighter Squad. I think it was the last. It might have been one other air wing on the Nimitz, but we had a sister squadron. So VF-111, and then we had VF-51. So both F-14 squadrons. They were in the same hangar. is VF-124. So literally it was like we got back from carrier qualification, and it was like, hey, you're going to the Sundowners, and you literally went, and if you had any classified materials, you went down to Intel, you checked them out, you took your patches off, stuffed them in your pocket because you didn't want to show up to your new squadron with your old squadron patches
yeah,
on.
Of course.
And literally just walk down the hall, walked into Intel, deposited your classified material, walked into the ready room, said, hey, I'm here, and somebody handed you a patch and you went to work. That's about it. My first flight with VF-111, it was kind of neat though. It was neat, the idea that I was getting into an F-14 with, now he wasn't a peer, he was very senior, very experienced Rio, but you know, there wasn't a grade just going out. You know, we were squadron mates and we're going to go fly the airplane, and it was Greg Keithley, chaser, and we went over and actually did an air-to-ground mission. They were really interested to see what I had to say about air-to-ground because I was the first pilot they had gotten out of the RAG that had been through air-to-ground training. So Chaser's like, tell me everything they taught you, and then let's go fly the mission.
That's amazing. And did you deploy on your first frontline squadron? Is that just like a natural thing to do as an F-14 pilot or Rio?
That's all we do. Right. That's all we did. Very interesting deployment, though, with VF-111. So at the time, the Navy still has a forward deployed aircraft carrier in Yokosuka, Japan. I believe it's the USS Reagan now, but don't quote me on that. At the time, it was USS Independence, was the forward deployed aircraft carrier in Japan. And they kind of kept an eye on things there in Eastern Asia. So we had tentatively been scheduled to go to Southwest Asia, to the Northern Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf, and be there off the coast of Iran and enforcing the no-fly zone over Iraq, et cetera, et cetera. At the last minute, before we were scheduled to deploy the middle of June, and this is about the time a lot of your listeners are going to be too young to remember this, when President Clinton is now in office. So this is 1994, I believe. Yeah, 94. And there is quite the dust up in North Korea, where North Korea is trying to build a nuclear reactor and acquire nuclear weapons. And right at this time, the USS Independence goes into dry dock. So our deployment to Southwest Asia was canceled, and we were sent to East Asia from basically June. We got back the day before Christmas Eve, December 23rd. We were deployed for 6 months in the East China Sea, the Sea of Japan. We made it as far south as Hong Kong to celebrate Thanksgiving. But that was our area of responsibility, was everything where the Independence normally covered. The U.S. Kitty Hawk and our battle group was there, and we were considered a tool or leverage in the negotiations with North Korea.
And one of our favourite subjects, because I'm going to have to get onto it, is DACT. Did you ever get to fly against the Eagles, F-16s, Hornets? And if you did, how did the Tomcat fare in that dogfight arena?
Well, we basically trained a lot with the FA-18s just because we had them in the air wing. Not a lot of hardcore visual maneuvering because that uses a lot of fuel, and you always have to be conscious of your fuel. Did a lot of intercepts against them. The radar that they had was very good against maneuvering targets. So kind of no matter what maneuvers we would do to try to defeat them or whatever. And this is the old. We actually had A model F-18s in my first air wing, but still very good. The guys who flew them were very competent, very good aviators, solid radar. Its detection range was very short. So we could kind of loiter outside their detection range, but for us to get close to them, they had good coverage. Were able to handle our maneuvers. Our strengths were we could see them far away, but we weren't always as good when they would start maneuvering. So a little bit of strategy, cat and mouse, very good training for the radar intercept officers. Only once do I recall doing DACT against F-16s, and that was when we were off the Korean Peninsula, and I believe it was the F-16s out of Osan, but it might have been Kunsan. They're all over the place over there. And we did one day. We only got one engagement with them. It was mostly beyond visual range. It wasn't particularly memorable. It didn't break down to visual engagements. Then when we sailed south one time, we trained with the F-15s from Kadena Air Force Base. And did a lot of visual engagements with them. And the Tomcat was very capable against the Eagle in the visual arena. The Eagle a little bit higher turn rate, but it was a hard wing airplane. It doesn't have leading edge flaps and slats. So if you got the airplane slow, our aircraft handled better slower because of being optimized for landing on the ship. So if you could get an Eagle slow, you could generally do some good work against them. But their whole thing was they wanted to engage on visual range, and at most it emerged would be some kind of slashing attack. But if you could get them to turn and get them slow, we could generally do good work against an F-15.
So, did you work with any with the RAF or any other European nations when you were on the Tomcat?
No, even on my second deployment, I did 2 more deployments. I switched over to Fighter Squadron 213 at the end of my first deployment. Never had any real contact with them. And that came later when I was on the exchange tour. We did have a very unique opportunity. So when the first Tomcat squadron I was in, VF-111, that entire air wing decommissioned as soon as we got home. So we got home the day before Christmas Eve, and the air wing basically decommissioned the end of the year. It was still kind of around, but it didn't exist officially anymore. A long story that I won't get into, but I volunteered to go immediately for Squadron 213. I was home about 2 weeks, maybe 3, not less than that. And then went on 1 month of workups with them, was home for a couple of weeks, and then deployed again in the spring of 1995. And that time we did go to Southwest Asia, to the Northern Arabian Gulf, the Persian Gulf. And an interesting opportunity came up. So the ship was scheduled to pull into port at Jebel Ali in Dubai at the United Arab Emirates. And the State Department sent some representatives out to the ship and said, hey, we would really like to get one of your squadrons or part of one of your squadrons to go into Abu Dhabi, to the Air Force Base in Abu Dhabi, and train and do dissimilar air combat training while the aircraft carrier is in port. And this got to be kind of an interesting discussion because everybody's like, hey, we're ready to go to port. We want to go, booze, lay by the pool, get some rest and relaxation. You don't know to go to work. And I'm like, hey, I want to go to work. I'd love to go. So there was a handful of us. We took several F-14s, flew into Abu Dhabi. I forget the name of the Air Force Base there. It might have been Al Dhafra. And turned out to be one of the greatest experiences of my life. It was absolutely first class. They put us up in a nice hotel on the beach. We got 85, I think it was dirham is their currency. And they gave us 85 dirham cash every day. We would literally slip an envelope underneath this was everybody, the officers, the enlisted, everybody that went on this deployment. And we were only there a week. And so the first morning you get up and you've got 85 dirham. We had no idea what this is. We didn't know if this bought us a Coke or a car. It didn't really mean anything. So you go down into the hotel and they've got a breakfast buffet set out for us. So we eat, we load on these buses and we go to the Air Force Base. And then they feed us lunch on the Air Force Base. So now we get back in the evening, after we've been flying all day, and we've got 85 dirham in our pocket. And we don't know what this is, what is this good for? So we decide, hey, we can, we haven't spent any money today. We can afford to kind of go to this nice restaurant. So we went to one of the nicer restaurants not too far from the hotel there in Abu Dhabi. And we're like, we find out like we're ordering, like these unbelievable steaks and everything. And they're like 20 dirham. And like we were getting 85 a day, and we're out there just having like the time we thought we were tycoons. It was like the greatest thing in the world. And the next morning you'd wake up hungover usually, and there's another envelope full of 85 dirham.
That's amazing.
Comes under the door. Yeah, and then we'd go out to the Air Force Base and fly daytime DACT against Mirage F1s and 2000s. Against and got to know those guys. They treated us wonderful hospitality. It was always challenging flying with them and debriefing based on what we could tell them or not tell them. They'd like say, "Oh, at what range did you shoot us with your Phoenix?" It's like, we're not going to have the Phoenix discussion. So we had to keep the tactics very rudimentary. But apparently, The visit was very well received. They threw a huge feast for us at the end of it. And subsequently, and the UAE had been evaluating Su-27s, MiG-29s, more Mirage 2000s, or F-16s, and subsequently they ended up buying F-16s. And apparently, a big part of that was that we had gone in there and spent time with them, and they really enjoyed that.
That's incredible. I'm not jealous at all. But yeah, to wrap up this F-14 part, can you maybe share one or two memorable stories that you think our viewers will enjoy?
Memorable stories usually involves my buffoonery, but I think that's part of the thing is now being out of the airplane, you can share those. So there was, I'll share two quick stories. These actually both happened on my first deployment on the USS Kitty Hawk. One night we were about 600 miles east of Japan, operating out there. And it was a nighttime launch. Snap Davis is my Rio. We launch, and as we go down the catapult, our displays start flashing, and then the displays came back on. We're climbing out, and the weather's not good. We're in the clouds. We're climbing out. We're going to join our flight lead up, in 24,000 feet. And Snap goes, "Hey, the displays flicker?" I said, "Yeah, and yours?" And he goes, "Mine too." I said, "Mine are fine now." He goes, "Yeah, mine are okay. I was just curious." So we climb out, and we're going through about 22,000 feet. We're now above the clouds. And all of a sudden, Mike, all I can see over my right shoulder is orange. And I'm like, it's bright and it's orange. And I can hear Snap screaming, "I'm on fire. We've got a fire." And I look over my right shoulder, and I could see the flames rear cockpit. I reached down. I knew it had to be electrical. Reached down and slapped the generators off and turned off the emergency generator. The jet goes jet black. The environmental control system goes full cold, full open. Our ears are basically crushed. We have no electricity at all. The cockpit is jet black. I turn a flashlight that's on my survival gear, flip it on, and I'm having to twist in the seat to point the flashlight at like the altimeter and the standby gyro to keep the airplane level and keep the airspeed. We can't talk to each other. We're having to scream at each other, take our masks off. We're screaming over the environmental control system. And he didn't tell me this till later, but all the wires that were on fire in the back seat, he takes out his water bottle and dumps water all over to put it out. And then he's screaming at me. He goes, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Let's try to bring the emergency generator back online." I bring the emergency generator online. We plug our survival radios into our helmet, declare an emergency, dump fuel. I've got the fuel gauges don't work. I've got a couple of lights in the cockpit now. The worst thing is the throttles were electrically boosted because the jet was so long. The throttle cables were, 50, 60 feet long. So I don't have power throttle. So now it's like trying to parallel park a car with no power steering. We get vectors down to final, and then I had to land on a pitching deck in the rain with hardly any cockpit lights and manual throttles. But Snap hung in there. Great guy. The aircraft aboard, he had some burns on his leg, and the radar was damaged. But the world-class F-14 maintainers got it back up and running. Took a while. Wow. And then there was one night. There's a thing called a night in the barrel, and there's two kind of F-14 pilots: the pilots that have had a night in the barrel, and the pilots that were gonna have it. And I got to join the club in my first cruise. So the way a night in the barrel happens is the seas will be absolutely calm. They're like, the deck isn't pitching a foot. There's usually a full moon. There was that night. The moon is so bright, you consider leaving the dark visor on your helmet. So we go out, we fly the mission, come back, fly the approach. The approach is going great. It's a bright night, steady deck. Maybe I let my guard down a little bit. Nobody knows why this happens. It's all psychological. And so I come around and I bolt her. Miss the wires, no big deal. Come around, bolt her again. Bolt her the third time. Now we're getting low on gas, so low on gas that they've got a tanker is now flying for formation off of my right side on the approach. Because if I don't get aboard on the fourth time, we are out of gas and ideas. Sure enough, come around, high, fast, flat, and close, miss the wires a fourth time. The tanker accelerates and gets out in front of me. I clean the gear up, put out the refueling probe. I'm drenched in sweat. My hands hurt because I'm gripping the stick so tight. Managed to somehow get the probe into the bucket. We're only at 2,000 feet, middle of the night. Take a couple thousand pounds of gas. Come around. So now this is our 5th attempt, and I miss again. And Snap Davis, God bless him, he's like, this is not funny anymore. I'm like, you think I'm having fun up here? Yeah. So we come around. So now it's the sixth try, and this it's either get aboard or eject. Yeah. I mean, this is, and I made up my mind. So as soon as we get over the ramp, the ball's still on the lens. Everything's looking good. I'm not going fast or flat. I deploy the direct lift control, which raises the spoilers on the top of the wing, and I put the stick in my lap, which what that does is the F-14, because it's so long, it actually drops the tail of the airplane. So the hook grabs the wire. We were getting aboard, whether by hook or crook, we were getting aboard. Now, the problem is because I had jacked up the AOA on the airplane, was the hook grab, and I could feel the tug of the hook, and I'm like, yes, thank you, God. The problem was we were still flying. So we were a couple of feet off the deck. The hook grabs, airplane stalls, airplane comes down like crap off of a tall moose, about jars the fillings out of my teeth. But we got aboard, and there's a rule. There was back in the day. Now, this is 1994. This is old school, old fighters. And if anybody, and I saw that this happened to other guys, you never said a word about it. You never gave them a hard time or anything. So we walk in, I'm dehydrated, I'm covered in sweat. We take our flight gear off. Barry's like, hey, how'd the mission go? You want to go grab something to eat? And not a word was ever said about it. Right. I had joined the club, that was it. And, you went back to work the next day.